Hello and welcome to Phase 3 Ministries TV. Thank you for joining me today. I am Dr. Keith Henry, and we have an exciting presentation for you today. It's called The Simple Believes Every Word. And we'll be looking at some elements of the pandemic, the current pandemic that we're in. And we want to look at, we've been hearing so much news about the pandemic, and we can't go outside, and we can't go this, and hundreds of thousands, even millions of people have been diagnosed with coronavirus. And we want to ask the question: is everything that we're being told true? Because we're uh, being led to believe that we need to give up many of our freedoms, our civil liberties, many of the things that we go about doing day in and day out for the benefit of everyone. And maybe if this pandemic was really true as it's being represented, maybe that might not be a bad idea for a while, but then again, maybe it would. So let's look at the question though is, are what we're being told, is what we're being told accurate? Is it true? Because the we want to know is what we want to know is are if we're going to give up our rights and our civil liberties and our freedoms the way that we're being asked to, we want to trust that it's for the benefit of actually literally saving our lives. That's essentially what we are being told, what we're hearing from the news media day in and day out, uh, and we've been hearing it for months now. And so we want to know: are these things true? Are these things so? On Proverbs 14:15 says, "The simple believeth every word, but the prudent man or woman looketh well to his going." In other words, if you're a simple-minded person, whatever you're told, you believe it. Where the prudent person, they look well into their going. They find out, okay, the way what you're telling me, is that accurate, or I need to find out the basis of fact. If what you're saying has basis in fact. Now, in the website off-guardian.org, something interesting, an interesting article by Kit Knightley says, WHO, the World Health Organization, finally admits PCR tests create false positives. Warnings concerning high CT value of tests are months too late. So why are they appearing now? The potential explanation, he says, is shockingly cynical. He goes on to say in this article, the World Health Organization released a guidance memo on December the 14th, warning that high cycle thresholds on PCR tests will result in false positives. While this information is accurate, it has also been available for months. So we must ask, why are they reporting it now? Is it to make it appear the vaccine works? The article goes on to say further, he says, many articles have been written about it by many experts in the field, medical journalists, and other researchers. It's been commonly available knowledge for months now that any test using a C2 value over 35 is potentially meaningless. Dr. Kary Mullis, who won the Nobel Prize for inventing the PCR process, was clear that it wasn't meant as a diagnostic tool, saying with PCR, if you do it well, you can find almost anything in anybody. There's an interesting concept here where they're talking about that the test that they're using to diagnose people with COVID is that now the test is, and it's been known for a while that the way they're running the test was going to give a lot of false positives, and this would be used as a result to create the idea or to create the image or the illusion that there actually is a pandemic. And as a result of this pandemic, civil liberties will have to be restricted, and governments and will basically gain more power over their citizenry. The same article goes on to say this has been public knowledge since the beginning of the lockdown. The Australian government's own website admitted the tests were flawed, and a court in Portugal ruled that they were not fit for purpose. Even Dr. Anthony Fauci, the site goes on to say, has publicly admitted that a cycle threshold over 35 is going to be detecting dead nucleotides, not a living virus. Despite all this, it is known that many labs around the world have been using PCR tests with CT values over 35, even into the low 40s. So this is interesting that the way they're running these cycles, the way that they run the test, they're going almost guaranteeing in many cases that you're going to have that you're going to get a high number of positives, and yet they knew or they've known for a while that this test would promote or that would give these false positive at a very high number. And so people who are being told that they have COVID, in reality, many of them do not have COVID. This when you're testing people who have no symptoms. And here you can see on the screen the way that this is done. Basically, that this PCR testing can detect even very small amounts of viral genetic material in a sample by duplicating it many times over through a complex laboratory process called amplification. And it's this amplification process that they're doing it so many times that it's going to essentially guarantee that they're going to get, in many cases, a very much higher incidence or percentage of false positives. And yet they would be telling people that you're positive, even though you have no symptoms, you're positive. And so these cycle thresholds, or these CT thresholds, CT is short for cycle thresholds, are being run many more times than they need to be to get an accurate result. Numerous epidemiological experts actually have argued that cycle thresholds are an important metric by which patients, the public, and policymakers can make more informed decisions about how infectious and or sick an individual with a positive COVID-19 test might be. Now, Dr. Mercola at his website, mercola.com, talks about how the CT is these thresholds, the way that they're running the tests, are actually the key to the pandemic. He says many, if not most, laboratories amplify the RNA collected far too many times, which results in healthy people testing positive for SARS-CoV-2 infection and being ordered to take off work and self-isolate for 2 weeks. To optimize accuracy and avoid imposing unnecessary hardship on healthy people, PCR tests must be run at far fewer cycles than 40 to 45 CTs currently, than the 40 to 45 CTs currently recommended. So remember, as was pointed out in the previous article, they've known this for a long time. They've known this, that by running these amplifications so many times, that you're going to get these results. And yet, all of the labs continue to do it. Now, the New York Times even, this was back in August of 2020, and basically the New York Times, they're basically, they've been all over this. They're actually, they're okay with the restrictions on civil liberties. They're okay with some of the science talking about the coronavirus, or even that which is not science. So New York is not necessarily friendly to any thing that may rock the boat with regard to the pandemic. But even the New York Times, in an article back in August 2020, says your coronavirus test is positive. Maybe it shouldn't be. And they went on to point out in this particular article that some of the nation's leading public health experts are raising a new concern in the endless debate over coronavirus testing in the United States. The standard tests are diagnosing huge numbers of people who may be carrying relatively insignificant amounts of the virus. Remember, the simple believe every word, but the wise look well into his or her going. It goes on to say most of these people are not likely to be contagious, and identifying them may contribute to bottlenecks that prevent those who are contagious from being found in time. But researchers say that the solution is not to test less or to skip testing people without symptoms, as recently suggested by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Now, the last part about that, I agree with the suggestion by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention that people who have no symptoms is really you don't get anything by testing, especially with this test. And so, but let's go on to look at a little further what this article says. It says, in 3 sets of testing data that include cycle thresholds compiled by officials in Massachusetts, New York, and Nevada, up to 90% of people testing positive carried barely any virus, a review by the Time found. So up to 90% of people who tested positive carried barely any amount of the virus. On Thursday, the United States recorded 45,604 new coronavirus cases, according to a database maintained by the Times. If the rates of contagiousness in Massachusetts and New York were to apply nationwide, then perhaps only 4,500 of those people may actually need to isolate and submit to contact tracing. So here we can understand specifically why then that you can multiply the numbers and create a pandemic, because the entire thing is based upon false positive, upon tests that are not accurate, that are wildly inaccurate. The New York Times article went on to say, referencing Dr. Michael Mina, who's an epidemiologist at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, they went on to point out how one solution would be to adjust the cycle threshold used now to decide that a patient is infected. This is what we've been talking about. So even he says, he points out most tests set the limit at 40, a few at 37. This means that you are positive for the coronavirus if the test process required up to 40 cycles or 37 to detect the virus. So they keep processing and processing and processing until they get what they want, up to 37 or 40 cycles. And then, okay, now we detect the virus, so you're positive. He went on to say tests with thresholds so high may detect not just live virus, but also genetic fragments, leftovers from infection that pose no particular risk. He says it's akin to finding a hair in a room long after a person has left. The article went on to say, this New York Times piece went on to say, any test with a cycle threshold above 35 is too sensitive, agreed Juliet Marston, a virologist at the University of California, Riverside. She says, I'm shocked that people would think that 40 could represent a positive, she said. A more reasonable cutoff would be 30 to 35, she added. Dr. Mina, however, the epidemiologist, said he would set the figure at 30 or even less. Those changes would mean the amount of genetic material in a patient sample would have to be 100-fold to 1,000-fold that of the current standard for the test to return a positive result, at least one worth acting on. So the way that they're testing is going to almost guarantee a pandemic. They're testing and testing and testing and cycling until they pretty much get the result that they want. And like I said, this has been known, as we've seen in the research here, in the information here. This has been known. This is not new. It's not like they didn't know it. The article went on to say the CDC's own calculations suggest that it is extremely difficult to detect any virus in a sample above a threshold of 33 cycles. Officials at some state labs said the CDC has not asked them to note threshold values or to share them with contact tracing organizations. So, of course, you're going to get a pandemic. Remember, the simple believes every word, but the wise looks into a matter. The New York Times piece here says in Massachusetts, from 85 to 90% of people who tested positive in July with a cycle threshold of 40, that's July of 2020, would have been deemed negative if the threshold were 30 cycles, Dr. Mina said. I would say that none of those people should be contact traced, not one, he said. Other experts informed of these numbers were stunned. So you have a lot of these experts coming out and making statements about a pandemic, and apparently many of them didn't even know that this was the way that the testing was being done. I'm really shocked that it could be that high, the proportion of people with high CT value results, said Dr. Ashish Yeha, director of the Harvard Global Health Institute. Boy, does it really change the way we need to be thinking about testing, he said. Dr. Mercola comes back also at his website, mercola.com, and he talks about the PCR test. And he points out how they've been used as a justification for keeping large portions of the world locked down for the past 9 months. He says not reliable hospitalization or death rates, just positive PCR test numbers, a large portion of which are from people who have no symptoms of actual illness. And he says these are the triggers behind the shutdowns. Experts are now coming forward in growing numbers denouncing mass PCR testing as foolhardy and nonsensical, if not outright criminal. Why, he asked? Because we're now finding that PCR tests rarely tell us anything truly useful, at least not when they're used as they have been so far. He goes on to point out that these tests cannot confirm that COVID is the causative agent for clinical symptoms, as the test cannot rule out diseases caused by other bacteria or viral pathogens. So because the test cannot rule out those, there are people who could be getting diagnosed with COVID who actually have something else, like the flu. And so this may be one of the reasons why we haven't heard much, if anything, about the flu this past flu season. And so Mercola goes on to say, in April 2020 study in the European Journal of Clinical Microbiology and Infectious Disease showed that to get 100% confirmed real positives, the PCR test must be run at 17 cycles. Above 17 cycles, accuracy drops dramatically. Now think about that. According to this study, this April 2020 study in the European Journal of Clinical Microbiology, They're saying that to get 100% confirmed real positive, the PCR test must be run at 17, but yet they're running them at 35 to 40, 40, and 41, even up to 45. And he says about above 17 cycles, accuracy drops dramatically. He goes on to say by the time you get to 33 cycles, the accuracy rate is a mere 20%, meaning that 80% are false positives. Beyond 34 cycles, your chance of a positive PCR test being a true positive shrinks to zero, as illustrated in the following graph from that study. And if you go and look at Dr. Mercola's site, you will see that he has the draft on his website, or the graph rather. He goes on to say by running PCR tests at 40 to 45 amplification cycles, you end up with the false appearance of an outbreak, and this grossly flawed testing scheme is what government leaders are basing their mask mandates and lockdown orders on. So here, and this is why I want to start off with in this little series here with the test. Everything begins with the test, because if the tests are flawed, then the outcome is flawed, and the decisions of putting masks on and lockdowns are all based on flawed information. Another scientific review, he points out, that looked into how the timing of the test influences test results and your risk of being infectious was posted on the preprint server medRx4, September 29th, 2020. He says 14 studies were included in this review. The data shows that your chances of getting a true positive on the first day of COVID-19 symptom, that's if you have symptoms now, this is not dealing with those who don't have symptoms, but if you have symptoms, he said that the chances of getting a true positive on the first day of COVID-19 symptom onset is only about 40%. Not until day 3 from symptom onset do you have an 80% chance of getting an accurate PCR result. By day 5, the accuracy shrinks considerably, and by day 8, the accuracy is nil. Now, these are symptomatic people. When you're asymptomatic, your odds of a positive PCR test being accurate is virtually non-existent. Finally, he goes on to point out that the critique against PCR testing is further strengthened by a November 20th, 2020 study in Nature Communications, which found no viable virus in PCR positive cases. The study evaluated data from 9,865,404 residents of Wuhan, China, who had undergone PCR testing between May 14th and June 1st, 2020. A total of 300 tested positive but had no symptoms. Of the 34,424 people with a history of COVID, 19,107 tested positive a second time. Yet, when they did virus cultures on these 407 individuals who tested positive, either for the first or second time, no live virus was found. Now, Dr. Mercola is interesting. In his site, he goes on to point out a couple of stories about how the same media, etc., that's been pushing this pandemic, knowing all along that the way that the tests are being done is not accurate, or at least the people who are giving them the information know better. A lot of experts are coming out pointing out it has been and have been all along. But here he points out how, in this particular article, we won't go into it, but just he points out here, unlike masks, there's actually compelling evidence, he says, that vitamin D, for instance, slashes your COVID-19 risk by up to 12.55 times, and there's absolutely no downside to it. And he's pointing out in this particular article how, while at the same time, the health officials who have been telling us there's a pandemic, while at the same time pushing these tests that are inaccurate and knowing they're inaccurate, they're basically tearing down natural remedies and things that could actually help, things that are known to help scientifically, like vitamin D, to help stave off some of the issues with COVID-19. He also goes on his site to point out the benefits of vitamin C for COVID, and from talking about 6,000 to 24,000 milligrams, and how some of the studies that have been done to show how effective. So here he's talking about how, on the one hand, the powers that be, if you will, are shutting down natural remedies and things that could help a real pandemic, while at the same time encouraging mask wearing and taking tests that are known to be inaccurate, and inflating the numbers of people who have actually been positive, and at the same time using that to restrict liberties, etc. And so he asked the question, if we ask the question, why would they be doing this? Why? What would be the underlying cause? And remember, the wise believes every word. or whether the foolish person believes every word, but the prudent or the wise looks into a matter. And I would submit to you that one of the reasons that they're doing this is because the medical system, as we know it in the United States of America, and to an extent the world, the medical system of the West has been taken over and was taken over a long time ago. And what we're really seeing now is Rockefeller medicine based on petrochemicals. And a lot of people may find this to be shocking, but long ago, when he came to power, he and others, Rockefeller, Carnegie, they essentially took over the healthcare system, and now it's based on petrochemicals and pharmaceuticals, and they stand with the coming vaccines that they want to give, the fourth vaccination. They're not only does it really restrict our liberties even further, your health liberties, your health rights, but it will also make them unimaginable amounts of money. So think about that when we look at this. Why would they have this pandemic, have these tests that have been known to be inaccurate, but yet all you hear on the nightly news is 10,000 more cases, 5,000 more cases, this many more cases, and they're using a test that they know full well is not accurate. And so, as I said a minute ago, the reason being is because it's not real medicine, but it's Rockefeller
Dr.
medicine.
Bill Livingston, celebrated cancer specialist, was the very image of the traveling snake oil salesman. He was neither a doctor nor a cancer specialist. His real name was not even Livingston. More to the point, the rock oil tonic he pawned was a useless mixture of laxative and petroleum, and had no effect whatsoever on the cancer of the poor townsfolk he conned into buying it. He lived the life of a vagabond, always on the run from the last group of people he had fooled, engaged in ever more outrageous deceptions to make sure that the past wouldn't catch up with him. He abandoned his first wife and their 6 children to start a bigamous marriage in Canada at the same time as he fathered 2 more children by a 3rd woman. He adopted the name Livingston after he was indicted for raping a girl in Cayuga in 1849. When he wasn't running away from them or disappearing for years at a time, he would teach his children the tricks of his treacherous trade. He once bragged of his parenting technique, "I cheat my boys every chance I get. I want to make 'em sharp." A towering man of over 6 feet and with natural good looks that he used to his advantage, he went by Big Bill. Others, less generously, called him Devil Bill. But his real name was William Avery Rockefeller, and it was his son, John D. Rockefeller, who would go on to found the Standard Oil monopoly and become the world's first billionaire. John D. set off to make his fortune in the late 1850s, armed with a $1,000 loan from his father, Devil Bill. In 1863, seeing the oil boom and sensing the profits to be made in the fledgling business, Rockefeller formed a partnership with fellow businessmen Maurice B. Clark and Samuel Andrews, a chemist who had built an oil refinery but knew little about the business of getting his product to market. 2 years later, the shrewd John D. bought out his partners for $72,500 and, with Andrews as partner, launched Rockefeller and Andrews. By 1870, after 5 years of strategic partnerships and mergers, Rockefeller had incorporated Standard Oil. The story of the rise of Standard Oil is an oft-told one.
In a move that would transform the American economy, Rockefeller set out to replace a world of independent oil men with a giant company controlled by him. In 1870, begging bankers for more loans, he formed Standard Oil of Ohio. The next year, he quietly put what he called Our Plan, his campaign to dominate the volatile oil industry, into devastating effect.
By 1879, when Rockefeller is 40, he controls 90% of the oil refining in the world. Within a few years, he will control 90% of the marketing of oil and a third of all of the oil wells. So this very young man controls what is not only a national but an international monopoly in a commodity that is about to become the most important strategic commodity in the world economy.
By the 1880s, the American oil industry was the Standard Oil Company, and Standard Oil was John D. Rockefeller. But it wasn't long until a handful of similarly ambitious and well-connected families began to emulate the Standard Oil success story in other parts of the globe. The Nobels, led by Ludwig Nobel and including his dynamite-inventing, prize-creating brother Alfred, and the French branch of the infamous Rothschild banking dynasty, led by Alphonse Rothschild. The Rothschilds and Nobels, the Dutch royal family, the Rockefellers. These early titans of the oil industry and their corporate shells pioneered a new model for amassing and expanding fortunes hitherto unheard of. Perhaps John Dee's greatest stroke of luck, however, was not supposed to be luck at all. Rockefeller had come under increasing scrutiny by a public outraged by the unprecedented wealth he had amassed through Standard Oil. Muckraking reporters like Ida Tarbell began digging up the dirt on his rise to power through railroad conspiracies, secret deals with competitors, and other shady practices. The press pictured him as a colossus with bribed politicians literally in the palm of his hand. Standard Oil was a menacing octopus with its tentacles strangling the lifeblood of the nation. Hearings began, investigations were launched, lawsuits were brought against him, and then, finally, in 1911, the Supreme Court made a monumental decision.
On May 15, 1911, the Supreme Court of the United States declared that Standard Oil was a monopoly in restraint of trade and should be dissolved.
In the current age, with the Rockefeller name now more likely to be associated with Rockefeller Plaza or Rockefeller University than Standard Oil, it is difficult to understand just how hated John Dee was in his own day. He was the head of the Standard Oil Hydra, an octopus strangling the world in his tentacles, a cutthroat gardener pruning the competitors from the flower of his oil monopoly. As one of the richest men the world had ever known, he was an easy target for the average working man's frustration and a magnet for the poor seeking help. Besieged by the downtrodden, despised by the working man, hounded by Ida Tarbell and the muckraking press, John Dee had the mother of all PR problems. The answer was simple: invent the PR industry. But it was not stage-managed photo opportunities like these that transformed Rockefeller into a public hero. In order to win the public over, he was going to have to give them what they wanted. And what they wanted wasn't difficult to understand. Money. But just as his father, Devil Bill, had taught him to do in all his business dealings, Rockefeller made sure to get the better end of the bargain. He would donate his great wealth to the creation of public institutions, but those institutions would be used to bend society to his will. Americans in the 19th century still prized education and intellectual pursuits, with the 1840 census finding unsurprisingly that the United States, a nation that had been mobilized by tracts like Thomas Paine's remarkably popular Common Sense, was a nation of readers with a remarkable 93% to 100% literacy rate. Before the first compulsory schooling laws in Massachusetts in 1852, education was private and decentralized, and as a result classical education, including study of Greek and Latin and a solid grounding in history and science, was widespread. But a nation of individuals who could think for themselves was anathema to the monopolists. The oligarchs needed a mass of obedient workers, an entire class of people whose intellect was developed just enough to prepare them for lives of drudgery in a factory. Into the midst stepped John D. Rockefeller with his first great act of public charity, the establishment of the University of Chicago. He was aided in this task by Frederick Taylor Gates, a Baptist minister that Rockefeller befriended in 1889 and who would go on to be John Dee's most trusted philanthropic advisor. Gates would go on to write a short tract, The Country School of Tomorrow, that laid out the Rockefeller plan for education. In our dream, we have limitless resources, and the people yield themselves with perfect docility to our molding hand. The present educational conventions fade from our minds, and, unhampered by tradition, we work our own goodwill upon a grateful and responsive folk. We shall not try to make these people or any of their children into philosophers, or men of learning or science. We are not to raise up from among them authors, orators, poets, or men of letters. We shall not search for embryo great artists, painters, musicians, nor will we cherish even the humbler ambition to raise up from among them lawyers, doctors, preachers, politicians, statesmen, of whom we now have ample supply. Although Rockefeller's resources weren't exactly limitless, they might as well have been. In 1902, he established the General Education Board to help implement Gates's vision for the country school of tomorrow, with a staggering $180 million endowment. The Rockefeller influence on education was felt almost immediately, and it was amplified by help from fellow monopolists of the era who were approaching the topic of philanthropy from the same angle. Although best known as a steel magnate, Andrew Carnegie's fortune started on the railroads transporting Rockefeller's Standard Oil around the country, and was greatly magnified by a lucrative investment in property near Oil Creek that provided steady, profitable oil sales. In 1905, he established the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, a tax-free foundation through which Carnegie and his appointees could direct the development of the education system in the United States and, eventually, worldwide. In 1910, Rockefeller followed suit by establishing the Rockefeller Foundation, which became the tax-free umbrella organization for his philanthropic ambitions. As the Reese Committee, a congressional investigation into the activities of these tax-free foundations in the 1950s, discovered, it wasn't long before Carnegie's endowment approached Rockefeller's foundation with a proposal to cooperate on their shared desire to transform the American education system in their own image. With this base for transformation firmly established, the Rockefeller Foundation and like-minded organizations embarked on a program so ambitious that it almost defies comprehension. They transformed the practice of medicine. As usual, the oligarchs that funded this change were also there to profit from it, and once again, John D. took his cue from Devil Bill's example. William Rockefeller had called his brand of snake oil Nujol for new oil, and Standard Oil spun off Nujol as a laxative under their Stanco subsidiary. Manufactured on the same premises as Flit, an insecticide also derived from Standard Oil's byproducts, Nujol sold at the druggist for 28 cents per 6-ounce bottle. It cost Standard Oil less than 1/5 of a cent to manufacture. Pharmaceuticals provided a lucrative new opportunity for the oligarchs, but in a turn-of-the-century America that was still largely based on naturopathic herbal remedies, it was a tough sell. The oligarchy went to work changing that. In 1901, John D. established the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research. The institute recruited Simon Flexner, a pathology professor at the University of Pennsylvania, to serve as its director. His brother, Abraham, was an educator who was contracted by the Carnegie Foundation to write a report on the state of the American medical education system. His study, the Flexner Report, along with the hundreds of millions of dollars that the Rockefeller and Carnegie Foundations were to shower on medical research in the coming years, resulted in a sweeping overhaul of the American medical system. Naturopathic and homeopathic medicine, medical care focused on unpatentable, unmarketable natural remedies and cures, was now dismissed as quackery. Only drug-based allopathic medicine requiring expensive medical procedures and lengthy hospital stays was to be taken seriously.
The fortunes of Carnegie, Morgan, and Rockefeller financed surgery, radiation, and synthetic drugs. They were to become the economic foundations of the new medical economy.
The takeover of the medical industry was accomplished by the takeover of the medical schools. Well, the people that we're talking about, Rockefeller and Carnegie in particular, came to the picture and said, we will put up money. They offered tremendous amounts of money to the schools that would agree to cooperate with them. The donors said to the schools, we're giving you all this money. Now, would it be too much to ask if we could put some of our people on your board of directors to see that our money is being spent wisely? Almost overnight, all of the major universities received large grants from these sources and also accepted 1, 2, or 3 of these people that I mentioned on their board of directors, and the schools literally were taken over by the financial interests that put up the money. Now, what happened as a result of that is that the schools did receive an infusion of money. They were able to build new buildings. They were able to add expensive equipment to their laboratories. They were able to hire top-notch teachers. But at the same time as doing that, they skewed the whole thing in the direction of pharmaceutical drugs. That was the efficiency in philanthropy. The doctors from that point forward in history would be taught pharmaceutical drugs. All of the great teaching institutions in America were captured by the pharmaceutical interests in this fashion. And it's amazing how little money it really took to do it.
The oligarchy birthed entire medical industries from their own research centers and then sold their own products from their own petrochemical companies as the cure. It was Frank Howard, a Standard Oil of New Jersey executive, who would go on to persuade Alfred Sloan and Charles Kettering to donate their fortunes to the cancer center that would then bear their name. As director of research at Sloan Kettering, Howard appointed Cornelius Rhodes, a Rockefeller Institute pathologist, to develop his wartime research on mustard gas for the U.S. Army into a new cancer therapy. Under Rhodes's leadership, nearly the entire program and staff of the Chemical War Service was reformed into the Sloan Kettering Drug Development Program, where they worked on converting mustard gas into chemotherapy. And once again, the Rockefellers' own snake oil was being sold as a cancer cure-all. The oligarchs' interest in the burgeoning pharmaceutical industry converged in companies like IG Farben, a drug and chemical cartel formed in Germany in the early 20th century. Royal Dutch's own Prince Bernhard served on an IG Farben subsidiary's board in the 1930s, and the cartel's American operation, set up in cooperation with Standard Oil, included on its board Standard Oil president Walter Teagle, as well as Paul Warburg of Kuhn-Loeb and Company, itself headed by Jacob Schiff of the Rothschild broker family. At its height, IG Farben was the largest chemical company in the world, and the fourth largest industrial concern in the world, right behind Standard Oil of New Jersey. The company was broken up after World War II, but like Standard Oil, its various pieces remained intact, and today BASF, one of its chemical offshoots, remains the largest chemical company in the world, while Bayer and Sanofi, two of its pharmaceutical offshoots, are among the largest pharmaceutical companies in the world.
So here we see the influence of who really runs the medical system. And so now we can understand why it's so important that we don't believe every word. The simple believes every word, but the prudent or the wise looks into a matter. So remember, we have to understand that he who pays the piper picks the tune. And so here we see that there was a petrochemicals. They introduced this basically snake oil through petrochemicals. They took over the schools by philanthropic donations. And by taking over the schools, then you teach the doctors what it is you want them to know and call anything that they don't learn quackery. The doctors only use what they are taught. And then you have the same doctors who set up and run the AMA and the journals, etc., and these same pharmaceutical companies that give money to the advertising to sponsor the television programs and the television stations. And when you watch television, you see these ads for drugs. So the television networks are not going to speak out against these donors that buy millions of dollars worth of advertising from them. And so even with Sloan Kettering, you saw that they got together and took mustard gas to develop it into chemotherapy, and they call that a cure for cancer. So we can understand then that why we need to be wise as serpents and harmless as doves, and remember that the wise looks into a matter while the simple believes every word. We look forward to seeing you in part 2 of The Simple Believes Every Word. Blessings.